Our group is very interested in what we call diseases of poverty. And that includes neglected tropical diseases. There are many different terms people use. But for us, the common denominator is poverty. While we think of these diseases as affecting Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, they do occur in pockets in the United States and Europe where you have poverty. The problem here is a classic market failure. If we're talking about diseases of poverty, it's not going to be a lucrative investment. This is not necessarily a market large companies or even early stage investors are going to be interested in. And in fact, there's a lot of data that industry does not serve these markets. Very few of the drugs coming to market in the last decade have been for these types of diseases. One of the ones we've been most interested in is tuberculosis, and particularly multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And for 40, 50 years, there were no new drugs developed for this disease. We still treat tuberculosis with drugs we had in the 50s and 60s, and that are still very good, but increasingly they're resistant strains, so they're harder and harder to treat. And it's really taken different avenues to get these drugs funded. One is the Gates Foundation, and other foundations have made efforts to do this, and they've worked with industry, they've worked with universities to promote several drugs. We think one of the most interesting observations is that one of these drugs was developed by a nonprofit. It's a group called the Tuberculosis Alliance, the TB Alliance, is a pure nonprofit which has really functioned like a high-end biotech company in developing a very effective drug called Protomanid, entirely with money from governments and philanthropies. And one of the questions we asked is this actually an effective model? Because this is a company that's not going to get any revenues from the drugs they develop. If the drug's sold in the United States or Europe, they'll get revenues. But that's not where the disease occurs. The disease occurs in Egypt, in Bangladesh, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in those countries, they don't even get a royalty. And the challenge here is it really turns economics on its head a little bit, and that is there's no sustainable source of revenues. So if they want to develop now another drug, and they have a pipeline of really interesting products, we think very highly of this company, this group. It is a company, it's a nonprofit company. They have to go back to philanthropy. They have to go back to governments to fund the next development and the next one. They're really good. They've pulled it off so far. As government now, as we're seeing in the United States, a lot of that money came, or a significant amount came from USAID. That money may not exist anymore. If governments back off on some of the funding for these things, that's going to stretch for private philanthropy also. So it remains to be seen how viable this model really is. We've studied the model, we've studied what they've done. It really is state-of-the-art drug development. We've also studied the back end of this, which is once they get the drug developed, does a nonprofit have an inside track to get it to people? Are they more trusted? Are they more closely affiliated with the nonprofits on the ground who actually have the patients, who are actually putting it in their hands, who are acquiring the funding required to actually buy the drug and ship it to the site where people have these diseases? And that remains a challenge. These organizations have historically been very wary of private enterprise. There's a long history of real serious antipathy between private enterprise and public health. And it does look like the TB Alliance has made some inroads there, and that they may be able to build a much more efficient track between that development process, which is very classic. They're contracting for it, they're outsourcing it, they're acting just like a private company, but without private capital. But they may also have an advantage on the back end and be able to take care of people in a more efficient manner. So we're really interested in studying this nonprofit model in more detail. There's very little guidance to go on here. Lester Solomon was a great scholar of the nonprofit business model at Johns Hopkins over the years, and unfortunately passed during the pandemic. But he pointed out that nonprofits aren't synonymous with charities. Many nonprofits, in fact, have viable business models. And in fact, in his studies, his tremendous broad studies across the world, what differentiates a nonprofit is simply they don't distribute their revenues or their profits to shareholders. So there is a cost savings, right? It does keep money in the ecosystem of health, in the ecosystem of developing drugs for the next disease and the next disease. But that's not enough. That's not enough to overcome the sort of problems we have attracting investment for diseases of poverty, for emerging diseases. It may take something else. What we find is the incentives aren't necessarily structured correctly. So a tax break doesn't help a nonprofit company. And yet many of the incentives from the US government through the FDA involve tax breaks, tax credits, R&D tax credits. And you may need different mechanisms to now put that proper incentive in the hands of nonprofit organizations. The TB Alliance did take advantage of an incentive called a priority review voucher. And that is because diseases of neglected tropical diseases is the language, because those developing a drug for those diseases grants you a priority review voucher that you can now sell to another company so they can get a faster review time. This was intended to be cash to a system that needed it, and it worked. Now, unfortunately, the price of those vouchers is not as high as many people might have anticipated. So we have an incentive system structured to incentivize for-profit companies, which is definitely necessary. I don't think as a society, we fully thought out the incentive structures to enable nonprofits to do their part as well. This isn't free, right? This does require continued government investment. It requires evidence-based policies. Those policies have to be very carefully crafted. And we think they should take into account nonprofit enterprise as well as the private sector. We don't see a huge role for government in developing these drugs. I know that's a sentiment that people champion, Bernie Sanders has championed. There are some other problems with government developing drugs that I don't think people have thought through more fully, which is really the long-term commitment. And whether government's really willing to make a long-term commitment to provide that drug forever. I think we're seeing the danger of that strategy with changing political parties, with changing political fashions. So we think nonprofits should be considered. We think for-profit companies need to be held responsible for what they're developing. And the government has tremendous leverage to really shape how those companies perform and what their incentives are. AI is going to change a lot of things here. And one of them will certainly be drug development and drug discovery particularly. For health, we think it's only a boon. That the faster you can develop drugs, from a science side, we have to do something about this failure rate. 90% of the best ideas the scientists have still fail when they're actually put into human subjects. And you ask, do they work? Are they safe? Are they solving our problem? So anything we could do to accelerate that, to make it more efficient, and we think AI will prove to be another tool. Whether it's truly a revolutionary tool remains to be seen, but it's absolutely where people are thinking these days. In my work, it enables me to read in areas where I have no fundamental expertise, understanding it's no more perfect than my students or my own reading of literature in law or in history where I'm not a scholar. So it really is, and I really grew up believing that this type of thing has tremendous power to extend our human capabilities. I don't tend to get off on the science fiction part of it taking over the world, but I think it makes humans better.